I'm Isabelle, your wine tasting coach, and I have prepared a presentation that I will take you through about what makes Cabernet Sauvignon special. What I'm sharing with you is, of course, based on what I know, but as you may know, I'm not a sommelier, I'm not a winemaker, I'm a sensory scientist, but I did some research and look at not about 71 publications. I created this report that really is comprehensive on what we know today, what the researchers have worked on in terms of Cabernet Sauvignon sensory qualities, and what are the influences that affect our perceptions when we taste a Cabernet Sauvignon. Part 1, the anatomy and the architecture of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes and wine. So, recent genetic studies have found that Cabernet Sauvignon is the child of a cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. And I would say the breeders were not very creative in naming the variety. They just, took Cabernet on one side and Sauvignon on the other side and named that variety Cabernet Sauvignon. Its home is Bordeaux, and but it's a grape variety that is very popular. It's planted all over the world, and most wine-producing countries are really producing Cabernet Sauvignon wines. If we have to summarize, its blueprint in terms of sensory characteristics, in terms of color, it tends to have a deep color, high saturation in anthocyanin, and I have a next slide to explain a little bit more. So if we compare to the class we had on Pinot Noir, which had thinner skin, the color was very pale. Cabernet Sauvignon is the other end of the spectrum. It's a thicker skin, lots of anthocyanin, which are the compounds giving the color to the skin and to the wine. So high concentration. In terms of aromatics, lots of black fruits, but also some green characters. And in terms of structure or texture or mouthfeel, as sensory scientists like to describe, this grape variety deliver a lot of tannins, a lot of polymerized tannins, which evoke or impart lots of astringency in your mouth. So it's one characteristic of this grape variety. And in terms of acidity, it's moderate to elevated, depending on where it is cultivated. So quite a very distinct grape variety. And for those of you who are the keen wine students who want to know more about molecules and flavor chemistry, but you can ignore that if you're not into that. If we look at the color, so I mentioned the anthocyanin, which are those wine pigments in the skin that really when the skin are macerated, before the fermentation, they release this color into the juice. And, once the wine is made, the color is quite stable. And as the wine ages in bottle, those anthocyanin polymerize, meaning that, they group with each other. And the color tends to go from deep ruby to really garnet and kind of a brick color. In terms of the fruit, I mentioned earlier, lots of black fruits and an interesting phenomenon with a molecule that is called beta-damascenon, which usually delivers some plum aromas, sometimes some peachy aroma. But in the case of Cabernet Sauvignon, researchers have found that this particular molecule plays an interesting role because when the fruits are very ripe, the green notes tend to decrease, and this molecule, the beta-damascenon, tend to amplify the fruit flavor. So meaning that it suppresses the perception of greenness and it enhances the perception of fruitiness. So I thought that was interesting. That's what I mentioned it. But the real signature marker of Cabernet Sauvignon is this green compound. The main reason I tend to dislike this varietal wine is this compound is a methoxypyrazine, and especially this particular molecule that evokes green bell pepper. And green bell pepper, the molecule, whatever its name, has a very low threshold, meaning that you don't need a lot of concentration of this compound in the grape and the juice to really detect it, so that it's very dominant and present. And thankfully, this particular note decrease with ripeness, decrease with sunlight exposure. So the greenness of Cabernet Sauvignon tend to be expressed more in cooler regions than in regions with more sunlight. Or and when the Damascenon, plays its role in modulating the fruit flavor against the green flavor. But the main reason that I have challenges drinking Cabernet Sauvignon always is that I'm very, very, very sensitive to this green bell pepper compound, sometimes more sensitive than instrument, which has caused trouble to me at some point. But you might not be sensitive to that, and that's great, or you might be sensitive and think it's completely acceptable. So there is no right or wrong. It's just that that's how our perceptions and how it works. If we look at the aromas, I know you are used to talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas. And I make some of my students laugh because for me, an aroma is an aroma, but the purpose of decomposing aromas, by primary, secondary, and tertiary is to give you an indication of their origin. So primary aromas or grape-derived aromas are, as we mentioned, the green note, the green bell pepper, but also the black fruit. And one of the typical, very characteristic aromas in Cabernet Sauvignon is this cassis. And cassis is basically black currant. I know many of my American friends are not very familiar with cassis. It's an aroma that we are very familiar in France, but I don't know if you have smelled cassis before, but it's very particular because it's very fruity, but it has kind of a green note as well. And I have a good product reference for you to work with if you choose to train your nose on cassis. The other black fruits are blackberry or a plum. And as I mentioned, yes, the green note. So black fruit, cassis, green notes, this is the core of the aromas that are grape-derived. When the fruit goes through fermentation, the precursor aromas in the grapes are transformed through the fermentation by the yeast, and it produces new aromas like the peach, floral, or even banana. And if the winemaker decides to go through MLF, standing for malolactic fermentation, then other aromas and other sensory transformations occur. Chemical transformation occur. New aromas and new perceptions can be developed. And the most famous is this diacetyl aroma, which basically is the aroma of butter. But it's also the malolactic fermentation also gives a bit of structure, a bit of mouthfeel. When the wine is fermented or matured, if it's a word, in oak barrels, other aromas are extracted from the oak. Vanilla, especially if the winemakers choose to have French oak barrel, or coconut and dill if it's more American oak. Then as the wine ages, other aromas tend to develop. So that's why I think wine is fascinating, because we have all these aromas that evolve, that come from different origins and that evolve over time. And even in your glass, as you smell a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, whatever wine, if the wine is complex, The more you smell, the more you detect new sensations. So that's the aroma in terms of, so we saw color, we saw aromas in terms of the texture. The tannins are very important, as I mentioned. And tannins can come from the seed of the grape or the skin. And depending on their origin, the tannins have different sensory properties. When they are extracted from the seeds, they tend to have low mean degree of polymerization. That's what the MDP means. Mean degree of polymerization, meaning that they are not polymerized, so they are like small molecules, independent, and those molecules tend to be bitter, like a bitter taste that you perceive on your tongue. And whereas the skin tannins tend to be polymerized, so they are grouped together, and they tend to be more astringent. But of course, as the wine age, the tannins polymerize even more, meaning that they lose this grip sensation to become more smooth. And people will use terms like silky, velvety, try to describe the perceptions by analogy of, clothing. So tannins can be both bitter and astringent, but also deliver some smooth mouthfeel. And I like this visual that really show you in terms of the tannin perception. What sensory scientists would say, well, it's astringency. Tannin is the origin, but the perception is astringency. How these perceptions evolve depending on the age of the wine or the tannins in the wine or the source of the wine. So if the source of the tannins are predominantly from the skin, so more polymerized, the perceptions that you will have are more like drying, grippy. And then as there is more polymerization, more aging in the wines and the tannins in the bottle, that's why you get this smoothness. However, if the majority of the tannins are coming from the seed, you never really reach that smooth stage. It's more like a coarse, harsh, very aggressive in your mouth. And you still have some graininess, some friction in your mouth as the wine age and the tannins polymerize, but are less polymerized because of their origin. So I know in the wine vocabulary, you will read, the wine is very tannic, or there are green tannins or ripe tannins. I think you have to create your own vocabulary based on your perception. I tend to be very specific and descriptive and trying to use more objective words, but silky might mean something different for different people. But try to avoid, for your own training, try to avoid just describing by this wine is tannic. Try to be a bit more specific and what is the perceptions that you experience in the mouth. It is more, there's almost friction, so that is drying, or the friction is really an irritation, like you have something coarse in your mouth, or is it smoother? Easy to swallow. There is no friction on your tongue or in your mouth. I think it's more useful than just say that this tannin is like this or like that. But that's my opinion. But I think it's more helpful as well for you as a wine taster. So that was part one, looking at the sensory architecture of the grape variety, looking at the varietal blueprint. We talk about the aromas, and then the structure, especially around the tannins. So that was a bit technical, but I think it's interesting to know where it's coming from and maybe try to precise and define some terms that are a bit vague or sometimes misused. So let's move on to part 2, which is about the terroir, the winemaking, and label.